Good evening, everyone, or good morning for Helen and others who might be joining us from Europe. Thank you so much for joining us for our first webinar in Earth Economics Week, co-hosted with the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, the New Economy Network Australia, and Future Dreaming. And I'll introduce those organisations in just a moment. But what I'd like to do before we kick off is I'll share some slides and acknowledge country, because here in Australia, for those who may not be from Australia, for many of us, it's important to acknowledge that we live on the beautiful lands of communities that have been here since time immemorial. So, as I was saying, welcome to Earth Economics Week. I hope you can appreciate those beautiful graphics by our fabulous graphic designer, James Lee. And so I would like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on Cubby Cubby lands, which is actually just north of Brisbane, up around here. And for everyone who's here, who might be in Australia or other places who have a similar acknowledgement process, please do feel free to write in the chat whose country you're on, where you are today, any features of the natural environment that have captured your attention. So I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present, acknowledge that lands across this continent were never ceded by treaty or in any other way. And here in Ayla, Nina and Future Dreaming, acknowledgement of country is more than just a few words. As a colonial legacy country, Australia has a great deal of work to do to ensure that the First Nations peoples of this land have access to and control over their own destiny and their own places. And more important than that, the work that we do inside our various organisations is humbled and respects in great amounts Indigenous knowledge and governance systems. So, just want to acknowledge always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And for anyone who's not from Australia or has not seen this map before, this is a wonderful map. And as Elder Mary Graham explains, it's not just a language map, it shows the governance systems of the First Nations peoples of this continent. And if you are interested in any of that information, there's a dearth of webinars on the Future Dreaming and Regen Songlines and many other places that you can find more information. But why are we here tonight? So what I'd like to do is introduce to you our three organisations and then come back to why we're interested in Earth economics. But I guess this cartoon says a great deal. It indicates to us that the growth economics or neoclassical economic model is supporting the eating up of the earth. And for anyone who's interested in different economic models, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that a lot of the issues we're facing today, whether it be social injustices, climate change, ecological deterioration, and so many other issues, some of it, if not most of it, is stemming from the mindset that has emerged through a particular cultural group in Europe who then took their ideas to other places. And now we have a globalized or so-called globalized economy in some ways that brings growth economics almost as a disease upon the land, eating up the joint and saying that that's progress. So AILA, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, what we're interested in is how we can transition away from the destructive nature of industrialized pro-growth economic systems and legal systems. And what we're really interested in is shifting towards earth-centered governance. And to do that work, we work across a whole range of different fields, but we're very interested in connecting systems change for law, governance, economics, and we, through that sort of structural analysis, we then connect with the really awesome stuff about being a human, culture, the arts, creating alternatives, using our imagination to rethink and reform the world that we live in today. And the other group, our sister organisation, New Economy Network Australia, is a network of individuals and organisations who work together trying to raise the profile of sort of pulling apart and unpacking what the economy is. Unfortunately, in Australia, we're still very much, in terms of government policy and large-scale international organisations, still connected deeply into the extractivist, GDP-oriented growth mode of being. And NINA is a network of amazing people across all sectors in society who are already doing great work, trying to shift the economic system to support those double goals. And it's all interconnected, of course, ecological health and social and economic justice. And last but definitely not least, Future Dreaming Australia, which I'm super proud to be part of, with Indigenous elders such as Mary Graham and Ross Williams and many other people who come and go as guest speakers and providing input. It's all about sharing knowledge together, cross cultures, so across the First Peoples of the continent, connecting in what Margot Neal of the Songlines book series calls the third archive. How do we build this better future for us here on this continent, and hopefully infusing those grand ideas with others as well. So that's by way of a brief introduction to who we are and why we're running. I shouldn't have put questions there, but that's just to celebrate the blue-banded bee. I like to weave blue-banded bees into every conversation. And really, so much of what we do is about decolonizing the way we think about the world. So for those who don't know, the blue-banded bee is one of 1,800 species of native bees in this country. And so much of what we do harms the little creatures. But what we'd love to see, as this graphic indicates, is rethinking the way we perceive economics, the way we expect our value systems to be reflected in that, and what are the structures and ideas that so many different folks around the world are grappling with. So this week, we're going to have some great webinars. Tomorrow, we've got a couple of folks from different Indigenous groups and Mary Graham talking about, so we have Mike Weiner and Glenn Woods and Mary Graham talking about forever industries. And then on Wednesday, we've got our wonderful team from the CAS New South Wales, the Centre for a Steady State Economy. Thursday night, we've got the wonderful Catherine Trebek talking about wellbeing economics. And then on Friday, we have Mary Graham, Anitra Nelson, and myself asking, what could a degrowth and decolonised economy look like? So 5 webinars this week, 1 Zoom link gets you to all of them. So please do stay in touch with us. Now, turning to Helen, what I'd like to acknowledge is that Helen worked with our wonderful friend Haydn Washington for many, many years. And tonight is not only celebration of Haydn Washington, but also reflecting on his work and some of his ideas. So I'd really, really like to thank Helen, who is an internationally respected professor in her field of work, and she'll tell you about some of the work she's doing and really reflect on the wonderful legacy of Haydn Washington. So tonight is the very first inaugural Haydn Washington Memorial Lecture. Helen will tell you more about him. He was a dear friend of mine as well and passed in 2022. So we miss him dearly. And his work was fantastic. And he's got heaps of books, which is a terrific legacy, I guess, to share his ideas. But enough from me. Helen's going to talk for 30-ish minutes or so, and then we'll open up for some Q&A and see how we go for time. So thank you so much, Helen. What's the world like over in the UK today?
Oh, it's perfectly sunny, quite unexpectedly perhaps, but yeah, climate has been changing and it's had some positive effects perhaps, as some of people might think.
Yes, well, perhaps the sun is preparing you for the Australian audience too, so I'm glad to hear that the day is looking pleasant for you. Those in my region are actually facing down a cyclone that's coming to hit us on about Thursday. So I'm hoping I can deliver all of the Earth Economics Week webinars. We will see what the power does and we'll see what happens. But over to you, Helen. So glad that you can share with us your insights and memories of Haydn as well.
Well, thank you very much for offering this opportunity, also because I do think that keeping Haydn alive, he can do it for himself because of the written work. And that in itself is very impressive. And I think his contribution is much larger than just one average individual could have done. In many ways, probably all of you have heard of him, at least. And actually, sorry, I'm a lecturer, so I have to do that. Can I actually have a show of hands if you have those icons to press? How many of you have actually known Haydn? Okay, I see some hands via the video and some little yellow hands. Sounds good. All right, this is the most unstructured presentation in the history of society, perhaps, or at least in the history of universities. The reason for it, partially too, is that I know that Haydn wouldn't have liked me to go through hundreds and thousands of slides, because he normally was the one who did it when we had common presentations. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my connection with him. And it started over a decade ago, and it started through a book publisher called Routledge. They've sent me a book proposal, which wasn't anonymous, so I could see the name. And it was about a no-nonsense approach to sustainability, and a kind of almost abrasive, almost rude way of talking about how some people indeed frame sustainability. And it turns out, indeed, it's a very messy, big thing. When we say sustainability, we can be thinking about economic, social, or environmental one. And within that environmental one, there are all kind of things that go into it. And the book proposal tried to say that, look, we can also simplify things. What's more important? What's most important is life on Earth, because everything else, and I must have said I work in a business school, or perhaps Michelle has said it. In a business school, it's very common to speak about the triple P's, people, profit, planet, as equally balanced. And in the book proposal, Haydn wrote that no, they aren't. The planet is foundational because without the planet, there's no people and no profit. He said a couple of things that really resonated with me also as a book reviewer. And despite the fact that I work for a business school, my background is in social sciences, as a matter of fact. And also, strangely, I publish in biological conservation journals. And that's the kind of interdisciplinary work that Haydn has brought into his book proposal. So I proved it. Routledge has published it. And basically, it is one of those volumes still that I very much recommend to my students to look at. Although, as those of you that knew Haydn or knew his work would know, he was extremely productive as well. Sometimes he would write 2 books a year, literally. Also, just today, I was looking at our publications together. And let me see whether I can actually share a screen with you. I'm not sure I can't share.
Should be able to help. Helen, you have the access to do so. If you click on the green share button, it should be able to
Yeah,
show.
okay on it. Now let me see. Share. Sorry, the vagaries of online meetings, of course, can be a bit confusing. Anyway, can you guys see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. I was looking at our joint publications today, and it turns out that there are about 40, which is incredible, and it probably wouldn't have happened ever without Haydn being so extremely productive and pushing for a lot of things too, and actually getting things done, very much so. I think one of the most interesting things here, you'd see the year of publication 2024. This one has Haydn as the first author. Obviously, he died 2 years prior to publication. How is that possible? Well, in this way, he kind of comes back from the dead. We started working on it when he was still alive. And basically, we still felt that he needed to be the first author on this particular one. Ecological and social justice. These are some of the questions that he was quite interested in. And in another volume, this one, unfortunately, it's extremely expensive, so I cannot really advertise it. And what I do is I just send my own pre-print copies. If anybody is interested, it's just online Word document. But in this particular volume, I thought what was remarkable was that Haydn was revisiting all kind of interdisciplinary streams that made him such a powerful writer and communicator as well. So he brought in not just what we call sustainability, this broad interdisciplinary umbrella, but he also drew upon his strengths as a biologist, Also, he was interested in zoology, and he was interested in botany, because one of his big obsessions perhaps was native species and plants, especially in the context of Australia. Haydn was also one of those remarkable individuals that stayed true to his own personal principles, and he walked his talk. He stayed in Australia and didn't come and visit any other countries and places because he believed that flying airplanes contributes to climate change, which he was absolutely right about. He also did not have children, for example, and one of his explanations was precisely that. Children are probably the worst thing you can do for the environment. So one of those uncomfortable things he liked to discuss was population growth, personal decisions, etc. And because he liked to say things just like in the first volume that I became familiar with, without any kind of flourishes, and sometimes indeed being almost, some people experienced it, very direct or almost bordering on rude. That was just the kind of thing that came into this particular volume as well. And no nonsense, say it as it is, honest in your face approach, which also combined some elements of this personal conviction. However, he was also wise enough not to push it upon others and respect others' choices, understanding that, for example, not everybody could be a vegetarian, and not everybody would be convinced by any kind of argument you could write in a book or in an article. He did tell me an interesting anecdote once about himself growing up, and I forgot exact details and I forgot age. And I forgot whom he was speaking to, but the story went approximately like this. He was about between 7 and 10 years old, I suppose. And he announced, perhaps to his parents, but perhaps to some other family member. And I've heard that his parents were lovely, so I probably shouldn't be too negative about it. He announced to them that he's about to become vegetarian. And the reply was, okay, this sounds a bit more problematic than even if you said that you were gay. So problematic at many different levels, but I think it might show, and what he explained with this, it shows a bit of a context of where he grew up. And it's not just his family, which in the end, he also said was very understanding and supportive and perfectly fine. And pretty much all the people he talked to, and he managed to at least have his opinion heard and understood, agreed with. But also the kind of context of Australia, in this case, the kind of families that he knew, in which things like being a vegetarian and at an early age just did not happen. Or things like indeed refusing certain things later on in life that had to do with consumption choices. So not using certain modes of transportation, the same airplanes is just one example, but there were many others. And in a sense, he was going very much against the social norm and a stream. And I know he was very close to his brother Matthew, and he always loved him and visited him, and also his family. But other than that, he also tried to have meetings like we have now, online meetings, also to save this travel time, etc. Now, I think another aspect of Haydn that needs to be remembered is not just his science and conviction, but also his poetry. Literally, he was a poet, and he wrote beautiful books of poetry, but also he had a very strange fascination with words which not just rhymed, but stood for something. And I'm really glad that Michelle today showed a picture of a bumblebee. And it was one of those things that words stand for example, certain types of animals and plants, and how he would bring them out in a poem, or sometimes also in a book, in a scientific article, but in a kind of poetic way that was really, truly unique. He interacted with nature on many, many different levels, and he said that indeed he's learned from Aboriginal native populations. And again, it's wonderful to hear that organizations that Michelle has introduced at the beginning today, and also she's involved in herself, very much respecting not just the land itself, but respecting traditions of those that lived on the land, still do, but in very different conditions as well. However, here it comes again that there was always this kind of brutal honesty, and even some of it was perhaps less politically correct. For example, in recent years, we started discussing the issue of indigenous stewardship and the kind of noble savage myth. And that was a more uncomfortable and perhaps controversial conversation, just simply put, observing the fact that lots of, there are examples, empirical examples of native populations in different continents that have not necessarily been the best guardians of the land after they've received land rights, which of course in itself, you know, if we are talking about rights and who gives rights, and oftentimes it was colonial regimes that even instituted the very idea of owning land and having rights to something and having property rights in particular. But anyway, all kind of complicated things having to do with, for example, once you've gained rights, things like mining, timber, any kind of extractive activities could be done. And actually, the fact that native populations are just as modern and perhaps have absorbed some of that Western economic outlook, and basically the idea that profit and money needs to be first. And again, these communities are definitely not homogeneous. One of the things is that sometimes within the same context of a village, for example, and here I'm talking a little bit with a different hat on, and that hat would be anthropology, which my PhD is in. Once you look at case studies and you realize that sometimes within the context of the same village, people might completely and entirely disagree about certain issues, such as deforestation due to timber industry. Some would support it, some wouldn't. And basically the idea that some individuals today or some groups would have special rights to, for example, hunt, which would result in overhunting and so-called empty forest syndrome, pushing the already critically endangered and almost extinct species, not just to the margins, but basically to the brink of extinction. That conversation, and indeed in the context of especially, for example, Aboriginal communities, and especially yet another very uncomfortable issue of population growth, because what you also did observe was that during the time of first colonial invasion, and by this I mean indeed Western people entering the country. And mind you, I'm a migrant myself. I was born in the Soviet Union and I have an American and Dutch passport and live in the UK. So those migrations are part and parcel of all our lives these days, perhaps. But in that context, the kind of treatment of native populations and also massive problems that came with it, among other things, diseases, of course, that were brought from the old continent into the new and wiped out sometimes 1/3 of the entire populations, and also pushed these native populations to the margin. They used to play a huge role historically. But now, and that was part of Haydn's research, we were talking about an increased population numbers pretty much everywhere. And increased population numbers also meant, as another colleague of mine who works in Australia and New Zealand, Veronica Strang, has discovered in the case of wallabies, for example, when you have a situation in which people start not just expanding their settlement because, well, more houses are needed, but also economic sphere of activity. And as middle classes are growing in pretty much all populations, including developing world, for example, or in indigenous populations, it also means that certain other populations, and they would be non-human populations, are being displaced. And this displacement would sometimes lead not just to displacement, but complete extermination. And there's a kind of, I think one of the most important graphics that we have included in one of our publications, and I'm not sure who found this graphic, and it has been updated a few times since, but basically I'm just trying to quickly look it up, but perhaps I should just continue talking rather than doing it. Okay, so if you imagine, if you're looking at this screen, and obviously it's a square, so imagine it's divided in two. In the middle, here's a line, and then on top, let's say just a small line at the left of the screen going towards the center. So there are basically three areas. One is on top, just a very small line on top. It's about 4%. At the bottom, there's a larger quadrant. Let's say it would be about 30%. And then on the other side, you have almost 70%. And that's the distribution of biomass on Earth at the moment. And in that largest quadrant, so almost 70%, it's basically cattle and animals we eat for consumption. So in particular, things like cows, pigs, etc., etc. I must say right away here, I'm not a vegetarian myself, and I'm not like Haydn, unfortunately, and I do fly airplanes, etc., etc. Nonetheless, when you look at this distribution of biomass on Earth, what you see is that in the slightly smaller quadrant, so a bit less than maybe 30%, that's us, humanity. And then that little part on top, 4%, just 4% left, this is wildlife. Now, this in itself, that visual representation is quite a powerful tool, perhaps, to introduce also in the context of well, lecturing students, etc., what we're talking about with biodiversity. And especially to imagine that the quadrant that represented ourselves and food we eat, especially land animals, terrestrial, but we can also talk about fish and all kind of other things that we're doing. It has been expanding exponentially. When I started writing with Haydn, I think there were 6 billion people on Earth. By the time he died, there were 8 billion. So 2 billion extra, which in itself is kind of incredible. Also, because if we imagine that it wasn't just that, it was also the growth of middle classes and consumption levels pretty much everywhere. And the fact that this vegetarian diet, or especially vegan diet, that Haydn himself was quite keen on promoting, that has given way to, in countries which used to be traditionally, indeed, vegetarian or vegan, in particular, for example, Hindu countries, and also in a lot of Buddhist countries, have given way to different meat diets. And also, again, if you look at sheer numbers, and again, here coming out of the business school, I can say we do look at statistics for consumption quite a lot, because that's what marketing people do, obviously. You want to know the marketing trends, you want to know what's happening. And what we're talking about is incredible increase in consumption of meat over the past 2 decades in India, that used to be indeed massively vegetarian, etc., etc. So these were some of the topics and sometimes quite uncomfortable discussions that we used to have, not just with Haydn, but a number of co-authors involved in writing, because Haydn was also very good at working together with groups of people, be they indeed indigenous populations, be they co-authors, trying to discuss things, not just push his ideas, but also listen very much to their opinions. And at the time of his death, and I must also say that he was writing till the very last moment, literally, we were communicating with him about 2 days prior to an email from Matthew, his brother, that said that Haydn is not doing very well at all and he cannot write, but he was writing from Haydn's account to say a couple of things. But yeah, this kind of a work that he was doing very much at the end, and he was trying to connect also to individuals that were not converted, not preaching to the converted, but basically trying to engage in conversations and dialogues that, even if they were uncomfortable for somebody, he still wanted to have that dialogue going. Now, I said to Michelle earlier that I'm still using his and Michelle's article that they have published in Ecological Economics Journal in my class for my students. And basically, my classes are quite large, as we're a business school, and in the first year we have almost 600 students, so that's a very large audience. What we try to do, and indeed in this way, Haydn lives in every single class that I'm giving as well. We have a flipped classroom approach in which we don't have 600 students in each class. We have lectures in a large lecture hall, but after that, students are split into smaller classrooms. And in those classrooms, they have seminars in which we flip the classroom, in the sense that students start with introducing the article. Students are the ones that kind of have to prepare for the class and actually start with discussion. And I was thinking of showing you one of the PowerPoint presentations they've done on Michelle and Haydn's article just recently. The thing is, right now, I'm also on sabbatical, and then I decided not to go into all these folders with all kind of student assignments. But suffice it to say that what's very interesting is that when you work for a business school, and you work almost, you can say, from the point of view of sustainability, in almost an enemy camp as a Trojan horse. So you come in the audience of individuals that are there, young people that are there because they want to get a job that would pay money, and basically because profit is one of the big drivers. So not people, planet, profit, but basically it's profit. That's the bottom line for many businesses. And also at the university where I teach, at Northumbria University in the northeast of England, it is largely, you could say, a blue-collar university. Many students there are sons and daughters, or actually grandsons and daughters of miners. It used to be an industrial center of the UK, of England. And many of them are the first ones to go to college in their generation and in their entire family. The idea of a white privilege does not exist for many of them, or they've never heard of it. There's a lot of poverty, and it's white poverty, let's put it this way, especially in the region I live in. So a lot of our students are the ones that actually see people like Elon Musk or Bezos or whoever as their biggest inspirations. It's a little bit like with rappers, you know, going from rugs to riches, and actually in some way also bling bling, trying to display this success. So sometimes too, talking about things like the need for degrowth, for example, when you're talking to a class full of individuals that they believe that what should be in particular very important is growth, economic growth, and especially growth in their own income through affiliation with especially large companies, multinationals, etc., seen as an aspiration. And I'm not there to tell them that they shouldn't dream this way and it's a wrong dream and actually multinationals are bad. and the profit is destroying the planet because, well, first of all, I'd probably be fired. But then again, that would never stop Haydn from talking about certain controversial issues. But I do think also learning from Haydn, the ability to listen and to have a dialogue and to actually ask the students that what drives them exactly, what makes it important for them, how do they relate to such issues as after they've read the article. And as I say, I don't talk about the article, I don't even explain the article. I ask them to read it, to present it in class, and promote a discussion in their own class about whys and why nots. And asking questions like, for example, would anthropocentrism, human-centeredness, be easily substituted by ecocentric or ecology or ecosystem-centered approach in real life using business case studies? And that's a tough one. That's a very tough one. We would be also discussing things like sustainable development goals. And sustainable development, as Haydn has said in his first book that I've read, is definitely not the same as sustainability, because basically we are sustaining, literally, development. And development, when it's economic development and industrial development, is normally part of the problem and not a solution. So environmental sustainability can be completely and entirely different than sustainable development, and in particular now sustainable development goals that became very popular in not just business schools where I teach, but basically at all universities through a very concerted effort by UNESCO and such groups to promote it as equivalent to education for sustainability. So one of the things we did together with Haydn, we used to have a number of presentations, and he was also a guest speaker for my students, also online as we speak here. For example, we would present a slide, 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And then the next slide would be a picture of, for example, Australian marsupial species, and saying what do, or koala bear for that matter, what do these sustainable development goals have to do with koala bear? And again, instead of preaching and telling to students or whatever audience, that question would be asked, and normally people would be split into, we could have done it now, but I'm not going to, kind of breakout rooms. If it was a physical lecture, obviously they would be just asked to sit together, and they are asked to discuss in the groups of 3. What do they actually think about it? And sometimes the answer that comes out, nothing at all. Nothing at all, because sustainable development goals are not about non-human species. They're not about animals, they're not about plants. SDG 14 and 15 are about life underwater, and is a very instrumental, functionalist use of biodiversity account, and not at all something that is talking about something that was very close to Haydn's heart, intrinsic value of nature. Because this intrinsic value of nature and ecocentric approach is precisely something that he tried to promote with the best of his ability throughout his life, because he believed that when we just put a price on nature, when we commodify it, the way sustainable development goals do, because also they embed the idea of equitable shared economic growth throughout those aims. And basically, they do not at all acknowledge that any other species on Earth, except for just one single species, to rephrase it differently, George Orwell's Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but one animal is much more equal than others. And again, going to the graphic that I hope you can also just look it up on your computers if you want, distribution of biomass on Earth, and then you see that just 4% remains of wild species, and that if that even that 4% is seen in instrumental economical terms, how we can use them. And indeed, in this case, if we go back in time and we see the same indigenous communities, native communities living, if not in harmony with nature entirely, but yeah, we can definitely talk about much more harmonized living than it is these days now. And indeed, I've mentioned the more uncomfortable thing about modern indigenous communities, perhaps in some contexts. But in the past, the idea of, you can call it noble savage or, native stewardship of the land, etc., that was true, maybe partially because of low population numbers and because there were no tools, there were no, means of transportation, also hunting devices that are used now. But yeah, basically, again, looping back to those central themes that were playing out, I think indeed the idea of different way of thinking drawn from those indigenous traditions and populations, at least as they used to be in the past. And we know that they used to be like this from ethnographic anthropological accounts as well. That is indeed something indeed that served as an inspiration for yet another book that Haydn has written, and that's a sense of wonder about environmental education and how to teach in a different way and how to teach using those ideas that used to exist in humans for generations. And it's not necessarily school teaching and it's not the ivory tower teaching, but it's the kind of connection with the land, a kind of connection and understanding that, yes, we're all part of nature, that humans are not something different, but we've forgotten perhaps how to actually be in this kind of harmony. And the idea of harmony, the title of 3 of Haydn's publications, in fact. And also the kind of subject that came along many, many times together with the idea of balance, etc., were some of the central themes used in his work. And now I believe I've spoken for about half an hour.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Helen. I wonder if we could come back to, I was fascinated to hear that you share math. No, sorry, I've been seeing text, and I want to acknowledge that Hayden's brother is on this call tonight, Matthew Washington. And I had checked in with Matthew a year ago and was starting to plan having an annual presentation or guest presentation for Hayden. So thank you, Matt, for joining us. And thanks for adding some comments in there about Hayden's views and your mum and good things. So Helen, one I was going to ask you, you said that you set the article that Hayden and I wrote together for your students, and you mentioned that you get them to respond, and you mentioned a PowerPoint presentation. You don't have to show it, but I am curious, in an explicit discussion about ethics, what are their opinions on having ethics in the economy or ethics in business? Do they acknowledge it as a thing, or can you comment on any of the actual discussions you've had with 600 people, students, about ethics in the economy? I'd love to hear what perhaps the younger generation are talking about.
Right. So, of course, it very much depends on the audience. And as I have contextualized it, perhaps my young people would be very different than the ones students studying something like just transitions or things like justice-oriented studies within social sciences, or for that matter, indeed, within environmental faculties. So within this group of aspiring businessmen and businesswomen, future corporate leaders as the biggest aspiration indeed. Yes, ethics. I guess we're back to the kind of idea of neoclassical economics that is ingrained in them from year one. That's how they start. And for me, it is always the largest challenge how not to make them defensive of the same idea, but actually open up a discussion. And indeed, one way of doing it is didactically just that. So when they read your article, and when they, so normally they present in groups, and by the way, I don't necessarily talk to 600 of them about the article, because what I do is I do lectures for 600, indeed. But then in classes, I have a team of other lecturers. So we are normally split, like I would have 2 or 3 classes and others would have other classes. So I just talk to those students, classes of 25 or 26. And I guess one of the things there is that, how shall I put it? They completely unaware of the term anthropocentrism, and actually, apparently, it's a very difficult term to spell, even for native English speakers, which is kind of remarkable, you know. Ecocentrism, sometimes they think about its economy-centered, and they confuse the two.
Wow.
After reading your article, normally I always tell them, okay, when you present the article, one thing I ask you to do is start with a description of who wrote it. I'm sorry, I'll just have to stand up and reconnect my computer to the charge because it's not loading. Oh, yeah. Yes, basically, they have to start with a bit of a background of the author, so they look up your background as well. Then they have to start with describing definitions, what are the most important terms, and that's when the word anthropocentrism comes along and they start breaking their tongues. And then they particularly start discussing ethics that indeed very much at the forefront of the article. And what you notice is that it's new to them. That's the first thing you notice. What's also quite remarkable, because at the end, what I asked them to do is not to end their presentation with question for the audience, like, do you have any questions? But to end their presentation with questions for the audience in order to open a discussion with the audience. One of the things I see very often in pretty much every class that presents this article to their classmates is whether it's realistic.
Wow.
And whether they can find examples, corporate examples, in which this happens. And that's actually why I love my students too, because sometimes it's also about, for me, to learn about certain things. So if they come up with examples of, let's say, Patagonia company, you know, the outdoor equipment company, and that they donate 1% of their income to, you know, some kind of nature development initiatives, or one of the founding fathers of Patagonia actually sold his shares in Patagonia Esprit and North Face that he was involved in. And then they bought this humongous piece of land called Patagonica now and actually use it as a protected wildlife area with only ecotourism allowed there. And the question is that enough? Is that what we're talking about when you apply this theory of ecocentric ethics to things like economy and business? And is it possible, even my students ask it, because one of the things that they also read about is yet another article of Haydn on population. And Haydn always used to have those disclaimers, always saying, because he would be attacked, just like many people do get attacked when they talk about population. He's not talking about any kind of population control, coercive, any kind of horrendous stuff like eugenics or, you know, some draconian policies in China. He's talking about voluntary family planning in areas where unwanted pregnancies happen, for example, things like that. And then my students in class would also ask, okay, would that really contribute to scaling down the, you know, the situation we have now, 8 billion people, and they discuss these kind of things in class as well. Again, I'm trying to do it in such a way that I provide them with the reading and then they go on with this. So my diagnostic is that first there's a lack of knowledge sometimes, but as we know, knowledge is not everything. You also need to have motivation. And motivation is, again, something that is crucially important. And I think with ethics, even more so. Because why do we care about things like diversity, for example, or things like we don't like racism and sexism. And these values, or human rights, for example, we just take them for granted that these are good things. Human rights are a good thing. Sexism is a bad thing. But these are value judgments, and we integrated them in our heads. And I think it's a wonderful thing we did, actually. But we don't ask ourselves, like, why are they there? Because it's about values and it motivates us doing things in accordance to those values that we believe in. Now, anthropocentrism and ecocentrism is somehow not the kind of value that most of my students, at least, that I've taught at different institutions and not just at business schools, are too familiar with. But also, I do think it takes a while, and maybe it takes generations, actually, in some cases, but also it takes parents, peer groups, etc., for things to develop and for things to actually take root. For example, we are always asked about, okay, so what did your class change actually in your own opinion, or sometimes on the basis of surveys, but I think it's more of a longitudinal thing. We also show them films without discussion sometimes and ask them to write reflection on them. So one of the films we show is If a Tree Falls, a story of the Earth Liberation Front, radical environmental organization that was entirely anti-business. And there we go. Hundreds of business students are watching it, not discussing it in class, asked to write a reflection on it. And through those reflections, indeed, I'm surprised just how articulate some of them are. We organize debates in class too. So one of the things, looking at the part of one of Haydn's articles where he talks about diets and vegetarianism, the debate is carnivores versus vegans. And the way it works, I say, I don't want to know what you are, because, well, actually, I assume in class, in my class, mostly would be carnivores. And then we split them into arbitrary groups, and then they have to defend their group opinion. So it's kind of interesting to see, a tough guy coming from the gym with tattoos sitting there like this. And, obviously he's actually not at all a vegan. Actually, it's not obvious, but probably not. And then he's explaining to another student, did you actually know that cows emit methane? And did you know that methane is one of those greenhouse gases and it contributes to climate change? So not good for climate. And did you know that welfare of farmed animals is horrendous? So if you like animals, you shouldn't be eating them. And did you know that eating a lot of meat is bad for your health? And he's explaining it to another guy who is, perhaps maybe it's those kind of flipped experiences. That's what we also try to do with your article, that after reading the article, we organize some form of debate or sometimes role play. We also do that. We have shell game in which we have roles in which Shell works together with the UK and Dutch government, but also with their shareholders, their largest shareholders, asset management companies, Vanguard Group and BlackRock in particular. But they also work with protesters, and when they're asked to think about protesters, that's after they've watched the film. So some of them say Greenpeace, but some of them say Earth Liberation Front. And then in those groups, they're asked to discuss some of the things you discuss in your article as far as Shell policy is concerned and whether it would change. So these are the kind of things that we are trying to do didactically to actually stimulate students, not just to engage with the material, not just to read the article and forget about it, but very realistically, we put them on the spot. And actually, they are all normally present in class during those activities because we make them, we link their assignments to what they do in class. For example, they do an activity and then they have to write a reflection on it. So they write on the subject of what they've read in your article as part of their reflection on certain activities they do in class.
Thank you, Helen. If people have any questions, please do pop them in the chat. I know that it's a little late at night for many of us in Australia, so I understand if we're just sitting and listening, which is great. Helen, one question I had is, you mentioned that, through the processes and even in teaching that group, let alone all the classes you've perhaps taught over the years, is there ever an opportunity for them to actually explore why they believe what they believe about the current economy. Because if, as you say, if if there's an assumption that human rights are good, but are they really? And there's all these different assumptions. Do they ever get to question their own assumptions about neoclassical economics, or are they only questioning these weird ideas like having ethics inside an economic system? Because I find it odd that some of these issues are seen to this day by younger people that I don't get it's a working class area. But yeah, do they have a question, or are they encouraged to question what an economy is or what the purpose of business is?
They do,
Yeah.
and I think they do through those activities. And indeed, you see it also reflected on in their essays. And I do find it remarkable that quite a lot of deep thought goes into it. And I don't mean computer deep thought, AI deep thought. But they don't originally, normally, because if they're not stimulated, or let's put it this way, provoked in a certain way, and Haydn was very good at provoking, actually, I
Mm.
think. And if they're not put on the spot, then it never enters their mind. But I think one of the biggest issues is that that's how they are brought up. And I don't just mean my students, but I think all of us. I mean, you read a newspaper and it's all about how bad it is if economic growth has slowed down. And it's very hard for people to think, how could it be otherwise? But then something like degrowth, what we also discuss is, and it's not the article by Haydn this time, but somebody else, Hickel, for example, and a few other articles on degrowth we read. Part of those articles discuss ethical aspects of degrowth, but then also certain complexities and paradoxes and bottlenecks. One of the strange things about degrowth right now in the area where I live is that it is promoted as degrowth, a part of degrowth, UBI, Universal Basic Income,
Basically.
which is kind of remarkable because we had also a meeting about it, and a large one. What came out of it? So it's supported by both the left and the right of political spectrum. The left, because they say it will help inequality, and it will definitely help poverty, and it will provide people with those necessary incomes, and it's an ethical thing to do for the poor. The right is happy about it because the benefits will be cut, the financial system will be simplified, very much depends on the amount that basic income will provide. But basically, what we also read about, and my students do and discuss in class, there's evidence that when you have this basic universal income, that people actually spend it on not just, writing poetry and beautiful gardening things, but on things that we normally spend money on, such as big screen televisions, whatever. And inequality is not necessarily reduced at all, because imagine if you were born in a rich family and I was born poor, without me first taking away whatever your cumulative income is, we're still going to start from different moments. So we both get £1,000 a week or a month, whatever the volume is, but still starting point is different. But what's even worse, and political right likes to talk about it a lot, if you are wise and you put your money in a bank right after you received it, your 1,000, and I were to spend it right away on large screen TV and actually even buy things on credit, thinking, well, I'll be getting a lot more of this money in the coming months. In 2 months, I will be poorer than you because I'd be wasting my money and you'd be wisely investing and basically doing things that might make you rich. So you might start with the same point, but then you can point out, hey, your own fault. We all had 1,000 and look what you've done with it in a year. You wasted it. And I haven't, and I'm rich. So, interestingly, first of all, with UBI, it looks like consumption of pretty much everything, including material goods, especially if it's more money than people usually would have had, would increase. Inequality might not be helped at all, and in fact, it might become more stark, etc. And these, again, have to do with those left-right political thinking and some of embedded ethics, and some of it is complex and uncomfortable ethics, like whether we believe that equality and inequality is a good thing or, like something entirely different. So, yeah, I think that's a very big can of worms there, but it's very much worth opening it when we talk about ethics.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And look, I might just finish up with a question from JP, which is, she says, she has a lovely quote. T.S. Eliot famously said, "You can't create a system so perfect that the people in it don't have to be good." And she says, ethics discussions often evoke principles around personal ethics, but what about collective responsibility? Do your students explore this in their conversations? It's a great question. Or even in the work that you look at, Helen, how much of it is sort of the personal responsibility versus our obligations to each other in business or ethics and economy?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about different levels of responsibility, because yet another article, so there are 9 articles that my students read, and yours is one of them. So in each class starts with a discussion of articles. So another interesting one is by Cindy Eisenhower. It's on Swedish consumers, and it's called The Effort to Stop Shopping, written in 2010. Basically, in it, she says that consumer responsibility and individual responsibility is nothing in comparison to responsibility of governments and corporate elites, because they control a lot of things. They decide, and also consumption, and production, which is controlled by them, is proportionally much larger than individual decisions. Also, when we delegate responsibility to citizens, consumers, it erases the need to actually make unpopular choices, which would be regulation, etc. It is very important to walk your talk, and as I said, Haydn was wonderful in his own life doing just that, and almost to an extreme. And for example, when I say I'm not a vegetarian and I fly airplanes, and I told this to Haydn and he respected it, which is quite amazing actually. But again, this is my individual choice. And I think, one of the reasons, maybe it sounds very strange to you, I used to be a vegetarian, and I used to have a period that I thought I wouldn't fly airplanes and I would not have children. And then there were a few suicides that happened around me. They had nothing to do with me. It just happened to be one in the family, one close by. I felt there was some negativity and nihilism accumulating, also kind of guilt, constant guilt, feeling bad about your carbon footprint, feeling bad about wanting to reduce your presence to zero. 1970s quote, love a planet, kill yourself kind of thing. The suicides were not related to it, but it made me think. It also made me realize that I was very judgmental myself towards others who were doing all these things that I wasn't. And I don't think at the time, I wasn't teaching at the business school, but I don't think I would have been able to actually do what I do with my students now without judging and listening a lot if my individual choices were very strict. Okay, so it sounds like a very strange justification, but for me, psychologically, it was one of those things. I'll become one of you. I'll become one of people. And actually, I'm going to try to enjoy material aspects of life too. And I will assert this life in a way that not only I, but I think the majority of people, for better or worse, also in developing world, aspiring to the same living standards, etc., as the rest. It's quite remarkable that the only individuals I know that are vegan, chose not to have children, chose not to travel, are the ones close to me in the Western world, and you'd say they are from a privileged class normally. It's a small, active group. And again, this is one of those uncomfortable and sort of not really politically correct discussions perhaps to have, but if the aspirations of the majority of people do not correspond to this group, it becomes very difficult indeed, again, in the context of, let's say, business school or actually even your friends, to do anything. Okay, I said I'm not a vegetarian, but I should say actually eat very little meat. It's just I'm saying it so that, once again, nobody feels guilty. It's just sometimes I also travel in countries like Cambodia, and if there's no choice and they don't understand the notion of vegetarian, then I just eat whatever is served. That's the story with that, I guess.
No, of course. No, thank you. That's a really interesting reflection on kind of, I guess, the cultural context, because if you're trying to have collective responsibilities, they're going to be different from place to place. And certainly the work I do, and certainly the work many of us are interested in Australia, which is decolonizing the way we think, then place-based work is really important because you have to respect local cultures, local places, the ecosystems themselves. In some places, eating the meat of a certain creature might be way better than options to grow crops in a place. So I often say, there's not one size fits all, but there's a whole bunch of things we can think about, talk about, and try to do together. Look, I think we might wrap it up. We kind of promoted the event as a sort of hour 15, and we've got a few minutes left. Although if you could answer one, we've got a nice question here from Alison. What critical question is, what is the purpose of education, and how do we learn, teach, and act responsibly, or how do we teach responsibility to each other? Maybe, Helen, if that's like something you'd like to comment on, it leads on from the previous question. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of work written in social psychology about things like nudging, for example, and basically the idea that preaching does not work. Sometimes just telling people not to do certain things. So, like, for example, telling my students, look, making profit is not good. Like, why not? Material dreams, wanting to have a big car, whatever, not good, doesn't work. It's the same type of psychology research that looks into what works and doesn't work in public campaigns, for example, or even health campaigns, for example, how to stop smokers or how to promote healthy lifestyles. So just giving information in a classical way, that is not enough, although it starts with it. People need to be informed, indeed, what animal agriculture does, for example. So those facts about methane and animal welfare, etc., they have to be introduced to it one way or the other. So we do it through readings and we do it through films. And yes, we do have discussions and we have all these flipped classroom moments as well. But I think what's very important to realize here is that education is a longitudinal thing. It doesn't just happen in a classroom. We give effective, also ethical tools, and not just understanding, but crucially motivation to do certain things. But we can't make them care about something on its own. And I think education works in concert with whatever environment you come from. And that environment includes, when you're younger, your parents, your peer groups later on, what you aspire to, where do you see yourself going? And it would be very naive and presumptuous of me to think that my classes, and I used to teach differently when I started as a teacher 29 years ago, almost. Gosh, I used to teach from a book and I used to tell them and it just didn't work. What I do notice through LinkedIn, for example, later on, 10 years later, 20 years later, yes, you do hear, I do have quite a lot of examples, alumni, etc. Something has changed in their life and they do partially attribute it to what happened in class. And then I'm, of course, very happy. Yes, they do come back to me. And in fact, if you work for 29 years and sometimes you work with 600 students per semester, oh yes, I have a lot of stories and a lot of positive stories, I can tell you. But yeah, and I believe that education is the tool, actually the most important tool, Most of my own publications are actually on environmental education. That's the only way, I think, whichever way we frame it and whichever way we do it, to actually reach souls and minds of people. So yeah, education is key, that's for sure.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Helen. Just before we say goodbye, and thank you very much for your time, and before everyone jumps off, sorry, I was meant to be on this site. I just wanted to actually, I just wanted to show on the humanities booking page, we had included a link to Haydn Washington's. It was just a small piece written by some folks about Haydn after he passed. So we do encourage you and invite you to engage in his writings and his poetry, and even just to have a look on this little page to read about him. And again, a big thank you to Helen for sharing her reflections and insights and her memories of working with Haydn. And thank you again to Matthew Washington for being on this call and for working with me to sort of give me the moral permission to talk about Haydn and remember Haydn. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone for being part of tonight and remembering Haydn and Helen, this sort of wide-ranging conversation, dipping in and out of the world that you live in, teaching and sharing at the moment with business students, and then writing and considering all these issues. So that's really appreciate you being with us. Just a final plug. I'm sure you've all seen it, but if you do go to the Humanities page, you will see our other events coming up this week. There's a lovely one about Helen, and tomorrow our Forever Industries webinar is at 12 noon Queensland time. Please check the time zone for your place. And then another lunchtime one on Wednesday, an evening chat with Catherine Trebek, and then a lunchtime webinar wrapping up on Friday. And if the cyclone wipes out my electricity, I will hand over to somebody else in the network to cover that one if I can't connect. I also just want to do a final plug. Tomorrow we will be sending out to the universe call for proposal for like officially launching the NINA conference, which is going to be really groovy. 10th to the 12th of October at beautiful Broadbeach Cultural Centre in the Gold Coast. Here's a little, forget the high rises, but look at the beautiful beach. Yay! And you'll already see we've got the call for proposals page has an online form where you can throw your hat in the ring to share stories about the economy, a whole bunch of things. Sorry, my internet could be slow. I have a group of teenagers playing online at the moment. There we go. That's the call for proposals page. Please have a little peek at that, lovely folks, and share it with your networks. It's going to be a hybrid conference, so you can get to that conference by the homepage neweconomy.org.au. And the goal of that will be to discuss all manner of issues to do with building new, localized, bioregional systems of living, loving, and getting on with life. And that will include the ethics of our economies. So without further ado, Helen, thank you for joining us in the morning of your day. And I hope that you have a wonderful day and the sun continues to shine in that rare moment.
Thank you very much. It was a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Sarah, my Ayla co-Zoom DJ, and to all of you. Have a lovely evening for those of you in Australia, and we hope to see you throughout the week. Thank you again, everyone. And thank you, Helen. We'll speak with you again very soon, I hope.
I hope so
Bye,
too.
everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you, Helen. Bye, everyone.